At the very mention of Israel and Palestine, many of us either bristle with the frustration and anger born of hardship and loss, or glaze over, already lost in a swirl of historical fact and conjecture. Perhaps because of those very reactions, and most certainly because the Regent Theater just premiered a powerful documentary about these two Middle Eastern neighbors entitled Voices Across the Divide, we turn today to a conversation about Palestine and Israel. Joining me is Alice Rothchild, a physician who long ago turned her healing efforts to these two peoples. Whether authoring the book Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience, co-founding and now co-chairing American Jews for a Just Peace, or writing and directing Voices Across the Divide, Ms. Rothchild brings a healing voice and perspective to this generations-old conflict. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me. What were your earliest memories of what it meant to be Jewish in the United States at the time, and what it was that Israel was about?
So I think my earliest memories have to do with family. I had a mother who was a writer, and she wrote on Jewish topics, so that was what the conversation was about. And so she wrote about Jewish immigration and survivors of the Nazi Holocaust and Jews growing up in suburbia. All the stuff that was going on was her material. And we did Jewish things at home. We lit Shabbos candles every Friday. We had a sukkah with our grapevine. So it was a very traditional kind of look at what growing up Jewish in America in the 50s was. In terms of our relationship to Israel, the thing I remember, my earliest memories are, putting the quarters in the little box to buy trees in Israel. Israel was this mythical place. It was this incredible thing that happened after the trauma of the Holocaust. Our family knew Holocaust survivors. Our rabbi was married to a Holocaust survivor. The Holocaust was very present in our lives, even though our family wasn't intimately involved in it. And when I was 14, our family made the pilgrimage to Israel, and I remember it very clearly. I still have the diary I kept, so I have actual memories that are confirmed. And we just thought it was a fabulous place. It was a place where there was going to be a country that would be a light unto the nations. It was a place that had sort of socialism and kibbutzim, and it was magical. So that was how my identification started. Separate
from that, of course, was the other side of the equation, sort of naturally evolving in Israel relative to Palestine. How did you, your family, your wider community perceive Palestinians and their growing claim to a homeland in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, there was no word Palestinian. Mm-hmm. They were Arabs, and they were the enemy, and we had almost no understanding of what they were about. I mean, in my diary, I have this really mortifying entry about the dirty Bedouin Arabs along the street in Beersheba. Clearly, I was very racist without even knowing it, and we had no understanding that there was an actual lives and cities and libraries and institutions and a whole world that existed before the State of Israel. I grew up with the land without a people without a land, and the Arabs was sort of an incidental annoyance that happened to get in our way. So they weren't a topic of conversation. They weren't a topic that was public in my community. It was just, they were the enemy, and we were fighting them so that we could have a safe place to be, and that was the full framing.
Okay, so in a sense, their claim, it didn't really enter into the conversation.
Right, and there wasn't the kind of organized claiming that there is now. It was they had recently been defeated, and there wasn't a leadership and movements, and I mean the nationalism that was part of Zionism and the nationalism that is part of Palestinian life was very nascent at that point. So it was just a totally different time.
But then years pass. My sense certainly from the documentary is it's largely maybe a coming of age in college, and your perspective shifts. Mm-hmm. Where previously you were looking through the eyes primarily of an American Jew who had high hopes for the State of Israel, you shift your perspective and are able to see Israel through the eyes of Palestinians. How did that shift occur?
Well, I'm a child of the 60s, so I got more political in college and became aware of the Vietnam War, and then went to medical school and got much more involved in feminism, women's rights, healthcare reform, and that was really my focus for a long time. But it helped me to start reading and becoming much more aware of how to analyze the way the world works, and to understand colonialism and imperialism and racism and all the isms that we grappled with. And so for a long time I had my adult self that was doing that work and my childhood love of Israel that was not doing any work, and they lived in different compartments. And for a long time also just trying to talk about those issues just resulted in people screaming at each other. I mean, it was such a hot topic and so painful and difficult, no one could figure out how to talk about it. And then I had children and I wanted them to have a Jewish identification, although I'm not a religious person, and we got involved with the Workmen's Circle, which is a progressive secular Jewish organization. And in 1997 there were a group of us, also some folks from Kehil Brera and from New Jewish Agenda, which were sort of progressive Israel-Palestine groups at the time. And we were talking about what are we going to do politically this year. And we realized it was going to be the 50th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. And there was going to be a major celebration on the Commons in Boston with fireworks and Israeli bands and singing Hatikva and face painting and bagels and the whole schmear. And there was not going to be any Palestinian voice. And we knew enough to know that there should be, but we didn't know much more than that. So we thought, well, we'll put together a proposal to the Jewish organization that was putting this on to have a peace forum in the middle of this nationalistic celebration. And we'd have a Palestinian and a lefty rabbi. We had this fantasy, and they would say no, obviously, and then we would have a protest march. That was our plan. So we put this together without knowing a whole lot, and much to their credit, they said yes. Wow. And then we were really stuck.
Surprise,
because we didn't know.
Surprise.
So we very rapidly set up a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. We invited other Arabs, we invited progressive Israelis, and we had a very rapid education into the history and narratives that we had never really heard, although we had some vague inkling given our politics. And we pulled it off. We had 200 people come. Barney Frank opened the panel. We all survived. And it was actually really empowering because I began to put the pieces of the puzzle together and think, that's what I was missing, and that's the story I didn't hear. And it fit. And coming from the United States, where we're struggling over civil rights issues, or what happened to the Native Americans, or women's, all the stuff that countries need to struggle with, it fit that we should be struggling with that when it comes to Israel. So that began a whole process of learning more and becoming more empowered to speak about it.
Right, right. And then if we fast forward a few years, 2003 sort of marks the beginning for you as part of and co-founder, co-chair of American Jews for a Just Peace, annual
delegations,
health and human rights delegations to Israel, Palestine. How were those efforts perceived by Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East?
So, well, first of all, there's no monolithic Israeli and there's no monolithic Palestinian.
Of course.
So the Israelis that we were working with, partnering with, we started out partnering with Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which is a fabulous organization of medical folks who both work in Israel on social justice issues, the poor, prisoners, Bedouins, issues that Israelis need to address, and also do work in the occupied Palestinian territories. So, we wanted to work with them. They were supportive of us. We were supportive of them. We were welcome. And since that point, we've gotten to know a lot of other Israeli organizations working on social justice and human rights issues. So that's sort of the world in which we circulate in Israel. In the occupied territories, we partnered initially with the Palestinian Medical Relief Society, which is a group that provides about 40% of the health care for Palestinians. It's a non-governmental organization. And so obviously they were very happy to see a bunch of mostly Jews, but we're a mixed delegation, who want to come do solidarity work, document realities on the ground, listen. I mean, just some of it's just listening and acknowledging. So we were welcome there. And since that point, this is our 11th year, we have coalitioned with many, many different groups and gotten to know many Palestinian civil society organizations, university professors, olive growers, just the whole people in refugee camps. So we've been very welcome in those communities. If you think about the sort of more traditional, whoever the traditional Israeli is, because it's a totally complicated society, we're not particularly welcome by folks that are not interested in having this conversation, obviously. So for me, the place where push comes to shove is getting through the airport, getting through checkpoints. That's when I sort of confront, like, oh, I'm not actually welcome here.
Right.
And so it's a push-pull kind of thing.
Right. And you're in a place where authority can be exerted to your favor or not.
Absolutely. And a lot of times I'm very privileged. I'm a white, Jewish, middle-class woman, and I get my name is Rothchild. That's pretty good in Israel.
Right.
But it doesn't always work in my favor, but usually it does. So I can feel when the privilege works and when my activism gets in my way of getting from point A to point B.
Right. And recognizing that there is no monolithic American Jew.
Absolutely.
How do American Jews perceive your work? Is it ensuring, or is it going against the promise of Israel?
So again, it depends on which American Jew. So sort of the American Jewish, more lefty, progressive camp is very supportive of my work and the work of my colleagues, because I work in a community. You can't do this work alone. And so, for instance, in that community, my film and my book have been very supported and welcome and whatever. In the more mainstream Jewish organizations, people like me are considered the enemy. Because what's happened in the Jewish community is a love of Israel and a love, Israel, right or wrong love, and a support of Zionism, right or wrong, has become the trademark for being a good Jewish person. And if you don't espouse that belief system, then you're out of the tent. And people are tribal, and the Jews are tribal, and so I'm often on the other side of the tent when you're talking about the tribal community. And I'm challenging sort of the what I would consider faith-based beliefs about history that I think need to be challenged, and people don't always welcome that.
Sure. Well, I guess too, when I say whatever the monolith it is that we're approaching, it would be particularly because maybe what's really needed here and what has been lacking is a more citizen-based movement that moves political institutions to make decisions that they have not made to date. What would be if every person amongst American Jewry had an equal voice, what would be heard louder? Would it?
Well, I'll tell you what would be heard louder. If you look at polls, if you look at older Jews, 50s, 60s, 70s, that segment of the Jewish population in the United States tends to be totally supportive of Israel, right or wrong. As you move down in age, you get around 35, and there's an utter disillusionment with the state of Israel, to the point where people actually don't care whether it survives or not. So one of the reasons why the sort of mainstream Jewish establishment, which I say very cautiously, is very upset and doing all this stuff to get younger people involved in loving Israel, right or wrong, is that there's a huge fall-off of affiliation and concern for the state. So I think what you'd hear loudly is that Jews who usually are fairly liberal on civil rights and human rights and women's rights and gay rights and all those kind of rights, Jews are saying, well, I'm going to keep that intact when I look at how Israel's functioning. I'm not going to buy the muzzling and the censoring and the limits that are sort of the rules of my community. And that contradiction is a really important contradiction, and it's driving people away. So I think that's the loudest voice, but it's not an organized voice, because if people are disillusioned, they don't go form a group to be disillusioned. They just go to Starbucks and talk about, fighting for workers' rights or something else.
You, as you mentioned, your mother was a writer. So writing largely on the Jewish immigrant experience
and
in
Jewish
America.
suburbia, exurbia.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You, fast forwarding a bit, are writing, documenting the evolving Israeli, Jew, Palestinian relationship. Do you find that sort of a natural follow-on to your mother's work?
Well, I always swore I wouldn't be a writer because my mother was a writer, and That's what daughters do.
Yes, of course.
And also, you know, she had a whole closet full of unpublished books, and I wanted to be useful, so I was going to be a doctor. And, you know. So, but it turns out that being a doctor involves listening and empathizing and documenting what you hear and trying to fix it. And, you know, so you spend 40 years doing that, and you get kind of good at doing that. Sure. And I also love storytelling. And I find, you know, one of the challenges is that this is such a painful, hot button issue. And, you know, for some people you say the word Palestine and they're already, you know, can't listen. Sure. That I don't want to talk to people who agree with me. I want to talk to people who are agonized, unhappy, you know. Sure. So the question is, how do you do that? And I find that the personal narrative is a very powerful tool. Right. So my book is personal narrative. My film is personal narrative. Absolutely. Because I want to get under the radar of, like, don't talk about that, and say, okay, look at this woman, you know, look at her history. Look at the picture of her grandparents. They look a lot like my grandparents. Look at her experience of trauma and dispossession. You know, that sounds a lot like trauma and dispossession in the Jewish community. Now, what can we make of that? What can we do with that? Because once you see the sort of enemy as human and as fully human, then you can't oppress them, and you can't be as racist as you were yesterday. Right. And, you know, that is not enough because you have to have political action after that, but that's the first step. So that's how I got into personal narrative. I didn't mean to do this, actually, but it just came very naturally. And it's very powerful. I mean, I find people that couldn't hear, you know, read my book and say, you know, it's the first time I got it. And I think, oh, okay, that works. Right. That's good. That's good.
Well, the shared story, certainly whether it be Israeli or whether it be Palestinian, in Voices Across the Divide, your documentary, what was striking was the commonality in terms of, geez, I had never met a Palestinian. I had never met an Israeli, and that separation is essentially, you know, supporting our different perspectives of our history. Right. Yeah. And my sense would be that that's what you hope to encourage amongst audiences to Voices Across the Divide.
Right. I mean, it's very easy to hate someone you don't know that you think is the enemy. And this is true of all conflicts. So the first step is to say, okay, let's look this person in the eye and see who they are. True. And the thing that has really struck me is, first of all, that I'm so welcome in the Palestinian community, and that I'm like, you really going to welcome me into your house? I'm like the Jewish oppressor. My name is Rothchild. But people make a distinction between, you know, an Israeli soldier who's coming to take your kid in the middle of the night and this nice Jewish doctor who happens to show up on your doorstep and really wants to listen and hear. Right. And that's good, because that means we're all retaining our humanity as people. Right.
Well, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Continued success. I hope more folks are able to see, certainly, Voices Across the Divide.
They should check out my website.
Absolutely.
Because I have listings of when the future showings are.
Good.
I also have all the interviews, full interviews and educational material, and it's a resource.
Super. Excellent. I thank you.
Thank you.
In the end, our histories, no matter how illuminating or misleading, flattering or damning, are about the past. We, of course, are left with the mission of fashioning our futures. Our question, will they be separate and distinct futures, or might we aspire to a future that is shared? For Alice Rothchild, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.